June 22nd, 1941. 3:15 a.m. The German 4th Panzer Group crossed into Soviet territory near the border town of Taurog, Lithuania. Oberleutnant Klaus Weber, commanding a platoon of Panzer III tanks in the 6th Panzer Division, had been briefed to expect primitive resistance. Soviet armour, German intelligence assured him, consisted primarily of obsolete light tanks and poorly trained crews. The Reich's modern panzers would sweep them aside like chaff before the scythe. By noon, Weber's confidence had transformed into confusion, then disbelief, and finally something approaching terror. His column had encountered a monster that shouldn't exist, a Soviet heavy tank that shrugged off German anti-tank rounds like a man brushing away mosquitoes. The T-28 medium tank, dismissed by German intelligence as a relic from the early 1930s, was systematically destroying his platoon. 3 Panzer III's already burned behind him, their 37mm guns having proven utterly inadequate against the Soviet beast's armour. This is the story of how an allegedly obsolete Soviet tank design shocked the Wehrmacht in the opening days of Barbarossa, how German soldiers discovered that their intelligence had catastrophically underestimated Soviet armoured capability, and how a tank designed in 1933 proved more combat effective than Germany's frontline panzers 8 years later. The T-28's origins lay in the Soviet Union's desperate attempt to modernize its military in the late 1920s. Following the Russian Civil War, the Red Army possessed virtually no modern armoured vehicles. Soviet military theorists, studying the lessons of World War I and observing foreign developments, concluded that future warfare would require breakthrough tanks capable of supporting infantry assaults against fortified positions. In 1930, the Revolutionary Military Council issued specifications for a new medium tank. It needed to carry a large-caliber gun for bunker destruction, multiple machine guns for infantry suppression, and enough armour to resist anti-tank weapons. Most ambitiously, it needed to weigh no more than 25 tons to avoid destroying the Soviet Union's primitive road network and bridges. The design that emerged from the Kirov factory in Leningrad was revolutionary for its time. The T-28 featured a multi-turret configuration with a large main turret, mounting a 76.2mm gun, and 2 smaller turrets, each with a 7.62mm machine gun, positioned forward on the hull. This arrangement provided 360-degree coverage and allowed the tank to engage multiple targets simultaneously. The prototype underwent trials in 1932, revealing both impressive capabilities and significant problems. The 500-horsepower M17 engine, a license-built copy of the German BMW 6, provided adequate power but proved mechanically unreliable. The transmission, a complex 8-speed design, broke repeatedly under the tank's 28-ton weight. The suspension, using Christie-style large road wheels, worked well but required constant maintenance. Soviet engineers spent a year refining the design. They reinforced the transmission, improved the engine cooling, and simplified maintenance procedures. In 1933, the T-28 entered production at the Kirov factory. Over the next 8 years, approximately 500 would be built, making it one of the most numerous medium tanks in the world before World War II. The T-28 that entered service was an impressive machine by early 1930s standards. At 28 tons, it dwarfed contemporary designs like the British Vickers Medium Mark II or the American M2 Medium. The 76.2-metre model 1927 32 gun, derived from a 1902 field artillery piece, could fire high-explosive shrapnel and armour-piercing rounds. While not designed primarily for anti-tank warfare, the gun could penetrate 50mm of armour at 500 metres, adequate against any tank existing in 1933. The armour protection initially seemed reasonable. The frontal armour measured 30mm thick, proof against heavy machine guns and light anti-tank weapons. The sides were 20mm, the rear 20mm, and the top 15mm. In 1933, this represented substantial protection. Germany's Panzer I, which wouldn't enter production until 1934, had a maximum armour thickness of 13 meters. Even the Panzer II, entering service in 1936, carried only 50 meters of frontal armour. But the T-28's most revolutionary feature was its crew accommodation and fighting capability. Unlike cramped European tanks where crew members performed multiple roles, the T-28 carried 6 men, commander, gunner, loader, driver, and 2 machine gunners. This specialisation allowed for much higher combat effectiveness. The commander, positioned in the main turret with excellent visibility, could focus entirely on tactical decisions rather than operating weapons. The layout reflected Soviet tank theory, which emphasized sustained combat capability. The main turret could traverse 360 degrees using either manual or electric power, rare for 1933. The gun had -5 to +25 degrees of elevation, allowing engagement of targets in defilade or on hillsides. The ammunition storage held 69 rounds of 76 meters and 7,138 rounds of machine gun ammunition, enough for extended combat. The forward machine gun turrets, while appearing odd to modern eyes, served a specific tactical purpose. In the close quarters, combat expected during breakthrough operations, these turrets could engage infantry in trenches or firing positions that the main gun couldn't depress enough to hit. They also provided overlapping fields of fire, ensuring no blind spots where enemy infantry could approach unseen. Early combat experience revealed both strengths and weaknesses. During the Soviet invasion of Poland in September 1939, T-28s of the 10th Tank Brigade performed well against Polish fortifications around Lwów. The 76 Mestiwat guns proved effective at reducing bunkers and pillboxes. Polish anti-tank weapons, primarily 37 Messerschmitt Bofors guns, struggled to penetrate the T-28's armour at combat ranges. Lieutenant Ivan Fedorovich Pavlov, commanding a steer T-28 in the 10th Tank Brigade, later recounted the assault on Polish positions near Blemishal. We advanced at dawn, 6 T-28s in line formation. The Polish anti-tank guns opened fire at 800 metres. We could hear the shells bouncing off the armour, a sound like someone striking the hull with hammers. Our gunner, Sergeant Mikhailov, was calm. He identified 3 anti-tank positions and destroyed them systematically, 1 shell each. The infantry followed behind us, using our bulk for cover. By noon, we had broken through 2 defensive lines. The tank performed magnificently. The only casualty was Kostenko's machine, which threw a track crossing a drainage ditch. More revealing was the winter war against Finland from November 1939 to March 1940. Here, the T-28 faced determined resistance in terrain unsuited to armoured operations. Finnish forces, equipped with limited anti-tank weapons but employing innovative tactics, destroyed several T-28s. The most significant action occurred during the breakthrough of the Mannerheim Line in February 1940. The Soviet 20th Heavy Tank Brigade, equipped with 24 T-28s, spearheaded the assault on Finnish fortifications near Suma. The Finnish defenders had constructed sophisticated concrete bunkers connected by trenches and protected by extensive minefields and anti-tank obstacles. The initial assault on February 11th ended in disaster. The T-28s advanced without adequate infantry support or mine-clearing equipment. 3 tanks struck mines in the first 100 metres. Finnish anti-tank guns, particularly captured Soviet 45mm weapons, and Swedish 37 Laslam Bofors engaged from prepared positions. The Finns had learned that while the T-28's frontal armour resisted their weapons, shots to the sides or rear could penetrate. 5 T-28s were knocked out in the first day. Soviet commanders regrouped and changed tactics. They deployed combat engineers to clear lanes through the minefields, used artillery to suppress Finnish anti-tank positions, and employed the T-28s in coordinated groups with close infantry support. The revised assault on February 17th succeeded. T-28s crossed the Finnish trenches, their width and length sufficient to bridge most obstacles, while their 70mm system guns methodically destroyed bunkers. The multi-turret design proved valuable. While the main gun engaged fortifications, the machine gun turrets suppressed Finnish infantry, attempting to deploy close assault weapons. The Mannerheim Line breakthrough cost the 20th Heavy Tank Brigade 11 T-28s destroyed and 8 damaged, but the operation validated the tank's design for its intended purpose. Against fortified positions with proper support, the T-28 was devastatingly effective. The problem was that by 1940, Soviet tank doctrine was shifting away from breakthrough operations toward more mobile warfare concepts. Recognition that the T-28's armour was becoming inadequate against modern anti-tank weapons prompted an upgrade program in 1939 and 1940. Engineers developed bolt-on armour screens that increased frontal protection to 50mm and side armour to 40mm. These up-armoured variants, designated T-28E, weighed approximately 32 tons. The additional weight reduced speed from 37 km per hour to about 23 km per hour and placed additional strain on the already problematic transmission. Approximately 100 T-28s received this armour upgrade before the German invasion. The vehicles equipped with these modifications would prove far more survivable than standard models, but even unmodified T-28s possessed one crucial advantage that German intelligence had completely failed to recognise: their 76mm guns. While designed for bunker destruction rather than tank combat, the 76.2mm gun-firing armour-piercing ammunition could penetrate any German tank in service in June 1941 at typical combat ranges. The German intelligence failure regarding Soviet armour capabilities was comprehensive and catastrophic. Fremde Heere Ost, the Wehrmacht intelligence organisation responsible for evaluating the Red Army, had identified the T-28's existence but dismissed it as obsolete. Their reports noted the multi-turret configuration as proof of outdated design thinking. The assessment concluded that T-28s posed minimal threat to German forces. This evaluation was based on several false assumptions. German analysts believed Soviet industry incapable of producing modern armour in quantity. They assumed Soviet tactical doctrine remained primitive. Most critically, they evaluated Soviet tanks against the wrong baseline, comparing the T-28 to German medium tanks like the Panzer III and IV, while failing to recognise that the T-28 actually outgunned both. In June 1941, the standard German medium tank was the Panzer III AUSH, armed with a 50mm Kubota K-38 L-42 gun. While this weapon was adequate against most opponents, it struggled against heavily armoured targets. The Panzer III's frontal armour measured 30 m plus an additional 30 m appliqué plate, providing 60 m of protection. The sides were 30 m thick. Against most European opponents this was adequate. Against T-28s armed with 76mm guns, German tankers would discover they were outgunned. The Panzer IV AOSF-F, armed with the short-barreled 75mm WK-37L24, carried a gun designed primarily for infantry support rather than anti-tank warfare. While the high explosive rounds were effective, the armour-piercing ammunition had limited penetration. The Panzer IV's armour protection was similar to the Panzer III, making it vulnerable to the T-28's 76mm gun. German anti-tank doctrine relied heavily on the 37mm PaK-36 and the newer 50mm PaK-38. The 37mm gun, nicknamed the Panzerknacker or Tank Knocker, in 1939 and 1940, would earn a more derisive nickname after encountering Soviet heavy armour. The Door Knocker, soldiers would call it, because it knocked on enemy tanks without penetrating. Even the 50mm PaK-38, a more capable weapon, would struggle against up-armoured T-28s and prove completely inadequate against the heavier Soviet tanks that would soon appear. The stage was set for a brutal awakening. German forces crossing into Soviet territory expected to encounter an enemy equipped with obsolete weapons and characterized by tactical incompetence. They would instead discover that Soviet armour, even designs from the early 1930s, possessed capabilities that German intelligence had failed to recognize. The first encounters occurred within hours of the invasion's start. Hauptmann Friedrich Steinhardt, commanding a company of Panzer IIIs in the 8th Panzer Division, engaged Soviet forces near Rosynia, Lithuania, on June 23rd. His after-action report, filed the following day, conveyed shock at what his unit had encountered. At approximately 14 hours, our reconnaissance elements reported Soviet armour moving to intercept. We deployed in standard formation expecting T-26 light tanks or BT fast tanks. What emerged from the tree line was unlike anything in our intelligence briefings. Large, multi-turreted tanks, 3 of them advancing in line. We engaged at 800 metres. Our shells struck the lead tank repeatedly with no apparent effect. The tank continued advancing, firing its main gun. Lieutenant Becker's panzer was hit and destroyed immediately. The shell penetrated the frontal armour completely, killing the entire crew. We attempted to manoeuvre for flank shots, but these Soviet tanks possessed surprising agility for their size. The engagement lasted 23 minutes. We lost 4 panzers destroyed and 2 damaged. The Soviet tanks withdrew only after we called in air support. Even then, one required multiple bombing runs before ceasing movement. I must emphasise that our 50mm guns proved inadequate. Shots that should have penetrated simply bounced off or made superficial damage. The Soviet gun, by contrast, penetrated our armour with ease. Whatever intelligence briefed us these were obsolete tanks was gravely mistaken. These machines are formidable weapons. Similar reports flooded German headquarters from across the invasion front. At Elytus, Lithuania, elements of the 7th Panzer Division encountered T-28s of the Soviet 5th Tank Division. At Grodno in Belarus, the 20th Panzer Division fought a day-long battle against T-28s defending river crossings. Near Dubno in Ukraine, Panzer Regiment 15 suffered heavy losses to T-28s, supporting Soviet counterattacks. The most famous action involving T-28s occurred near Raseiniai, Lithuania, where a single KV-1 heavy tank famously held up an entire German division. But T-28s were also present in this battle, and their performance was equally impressive. On June 24th, elements of the Soviet 2nd Tank Division, equipped with a mixture of T-28s, BT-7s, and one company of KV-1 heavy tanks, counterattacked German positions near Raseiniai. The Soviet force had been hastily assembled from units scattered by the German advance. Coordination was poor, communications were sporadic, and tactical direction was minimal. Yet the attack achieved remarkable results. Oberleutnant Hans Schaefer, whose platoon of Panzer IIIs was positioned defending a crossroads near Raseiniai, described the Soviet assault. They came at us in the late afternoon, silhouetted against the sun. The first we knew of the attack was when Müller's Panzer exploded. The turret separated from the hull and flew through the air like a toy. Then we saw them, 7 large tanks advancing in a ragged line. We engaged at maximum range, 100-200 metres, hoping to stop them before they closed. Our shells struck repeatedly. We could see the hits, bright flashes on their armour, but they kept coming. My gunner, Feldwebel Kraus, was firing as fast as the loader could reload. Nothing stopped them. At 400 metres they began firing in earnest. Kraus's next shot was our last. A shell hit our turret front, penetrating completely. Kraus and the loader died instantly. I was wounded by fragments. The driver managed to reverse behind a building. From cover I watched these Soviet tanks destroy our position. 5 of our 7 panzers were burning. The Soviet tanks moved through our lines, firing at anything that moved. They destroyed our supply trucks, our half-tracks, even our field kitchen. The attack was not sophisticated, just overwhelming firepower delivered by machines that our weapons couldn't stop. We withdrew after dark, leaving our dead and most of our equipment. It was our first taste of what this campaign would really cost. The T-28's impact extended beyond direct combat. Their presence forced German commanders to revise tactics and call forward heavier weapons. The 80mm flak gun, originally an anti-aircraft weapon, was increasingly deployed in anti-tank roles. This redeployment weakened German air defences and diverted resources from their intended purposes. German infantry discovered that their standard anti-tank weapons were inadequate. The 37mm or Pak-36, which had performed adequately in Poland and France, couldn't reliably penetrate T-28 armour. Even the 50mm Pak-38 required flank or rear shots for guaranteed penetration. Infantry units encountering T-28s without adequate anti-tank support were effectively helpless. The psychological impact was significant. German soldiers had been conditioned to expect easy victories against a technologically inferior opponent. Discovering that Soviet tanks could destroy German panzers with impunity, while shrugging off return fire shattered assumptions about German material superiority. Propaganda had portrayed the Soviets as Slavic subhumans incapable of sophisticated engineering. The reality was far different. The T-28's mechanical reliability, always questionable in peacetime, became critical under combat conditions. Soviet maintenance practices, already poor, collapsed under the chaos of the invasion's first weeks. Many T-28s were abandoned due to mechanical failure rather than enemy action. Thrown tracks, transmission failures, and engine problems immobilized tanks that German weapons couldn't destroy. Lieutenant Dmitry Lavrenenko, who would later become one of the Soviet Union's most successful tank aces, served as a T-28 commander in June 1941. He later described the frustration of commanding a powerful weapon hobbled by mechanical problems. Our T-28 was a beast when it worked. The gun could destroy any German tank we encountered. The armour, especially after the bolt-on screens were added, could resist their anti-tank guns at most ranges, but keeping it operational was a constant struggle. The transmission required constant attention. The engine overheated in the summer heat. The tracks needed adjustment after every few kilometres. We spent more time repairing the tank than fighting in it. On June 27th, we were advancing to support a counterattack near Minsk. The transmission failed 10 kilometers from the front line. We spent 6 hours attempting repairs in a forest, waiting for recovery vehicles that never came. Eventually, we received orders to destroy the tank and withdraw on foot. I set demolition charges in the engine compartment and turret. As we marched away, I watched it burn. A perfectly functional weapon, undamaged by the enemy, destroyed because we couldn't keep it running. This scenario repeated across the front. Of approximately 450 T-28s in service when the invasion began, German forces directly destroyed perhaps 150 in combat. The remainder were abandoned due to mechanical failure, lack of fuel, or the general chaos of the Soviet retreat. Yet even this incomplete success came at a cost that shocked German commanders. The exchange ratio, German tanks destroyed versus T-28s, knocked out in combat, heavily favoured the Soviets in many engagements. German tactical doctrine, developed against French and British armour, proved inadequate against Soviet tanks. The standard approach of frontal engagement at medium range relying on superior German gunnery and tactics resulted in unacceptable losses when facing T-28s. German commanders were forced to adapt. New tactics emphasised flank attacks, ambushes, and concentration of anti-tank weapons. The 80mm flak gun became the primary weapon for engaging heavy Soviet armour. Luftwaffe close air support was increasingly directed against Soviet tanks. These adaptations worked but required resources and time that German planners hadn't anticipated. The appearance of even heavier Soviet tanks, the KV-1 and T-34, in late June and July 1941, overshadowed the T-28 in historical memory. These modern designs, genuinely superior to anything Germany possessed, captured attention and drove German development of more capable anti-tank weapons. But the T-28 had already delivered the first shock, the first indication that German assumptions about Soviet capabilities were dangerously wrong. A telling German intelligence report from July 1941, captured by Soviet forces in 1940, assessed Soviet armour encountered in the first month of fighting. The evaluation of the T-28 revised earlier, dismissive assessments. The T-28 medium tank, previously assessed as obsolete, has proven to be a capable and dangerous opponent. Its 76mm gun can penetrate all German tanks currently deployed at combat ranges. The armour, particularly on up-armoured variants, is adequate against our 37mm and 50m anti-tank guns at typical engagement distances. The multi-turret configuration, while unusual, provides excellent anti-infantry capability. The tank's main weaknesses are mechanical reliability and limited crew training. When properly employed with adequate support and maintenance, the T-28 is superior to our Panzer III and comparable to our Panzer IV in combat effectiveness. The large number of these tanks abandoned due to mechanical failure should not obscure their combat potential when operational. This represents a significant revision of our previous intelligence assessments. If the Soviets possess hundreds of supposedly obsolete tanks with this level of capability, we must urgently re-evaluate our assumptions about their modern tank designs. Individual T-28s achieved remarkable success in skilled hands. Senior Lieutenant Semyon Konovalov, commanding a T-28 in the 5th Tank Division, was credited with destroying 7 German tanks and 4 anti-tank guns during the fighting around Elytus in late June 1941. His tank, an up-armoured T-28E, survived 4 separate engagements before being disabled by a 88 Nilaport hit on July 3rd. Konovalov's after-action reports, preserved in Soviet archives, detailed effective T-28 tactics. The key is using our advantages while minimizing weaknesses. The 70 cm gun can engage German tanks at ranges where they struggle to penetrate our armour. I instruct my gunner to engage at 800 to 1000 metres whenever possible. At these distances, our armour-piercing rounds are effective, while German 50mm guns lack penetration. The multi-turret configuration requires careful crew coordination. I assign one machine gunner to watch our flanks continuously, while the other supports the main gun's engagements. This division of responsibility has saved us twice when German infantry attempted to approach with demolition charges. The tank's size makes concealment difficult, so I prefer to fight from prepared positions when possible. We dig in the hull, leaving only the turret exposed. This reduces our profile and provides additional protection. Movement between positions must be swift. The Germans have learned that our mobility is limited, so they attempt to force movement into prepared killing zones. The greatest danger is not German tanks, but their 80 Flammenwerfers flak guns. These weapons can penetrate our armour at any range. When we identify an 80 Blasonbeyond position, we must either eliminate it immediately or withdraw. There is no middle option. The mechanical reliability problem has no tactical solution. We perform maintenance constantly, but the transmission remains our most critical vulnerability. I have requested a replacement tank twice, but none are available. We continue fighting with this machine until it dies, or we do. By August 1941, the surviving T-28s were increasingly rare. Attrition from combat and mechanical failure had reduced their numbers drastically. The appearance of T-34s and KV-1s in larger numbers meant that remaining T-28s were often relegated to secondary roles, infantry support, defensive positions, and training. Yet even in these diminished circumstances, T-28s continued influencing German tactical development. Captured T-28s were extensively evaluated by German technical intelligence. Engineers from Waffenamt, the Wehrmacht's Weapons Development Office, conducted detailed studies of the tank's design and construction. These evaluations, combined with combat experience, influenced German tank development. The reports on the T-28's 76-meter gun were particularly significant. German analysts recognized that the penetration achieved by this weapon, firing relatively simple armor-piercing ammunition, indicated that larger caliber guns offered substantial advantages in anti-tank warfare. This contributed to the decision to upgun the Panzer IV with the long-barreled 75mm capable K40, a weapon that would restore some parity in tank versus tank combat. The T-28's armor protection, especially the up-armored variants, demonstrated that bolt-on armor could effectively increase survivability without requiring complete redesign. This influenced German decisions to add applique armor to existing tank designs and informed specifications for future vehicles. Perhaps most significantly, the T-28's combat performance shattered German confidence in their intelligence assessments. If an allegedly obsolete 1933 design could outfight Germany's frontline tanks, what capabilities did Soviet modern designs possess? This question drove urgent German efforts to capture and evaluate T-34s and KV-1s, leading to crash programs developing the Panther and Tiger tanks. Some T-28s survived into 1942, fighting in defensive battles around Moscow and Leningrad. The siege of Leningrad saw several T-28s incorporated into static defensive positions, their mobility sacrificed but their 70 cm guns remaining useful for supporting infantry. One T-28, positioned near the Pulkovo Heights south of Leningrad, reportedly remained operational until autumn 1942, when it was finally destroyed by German artillery after supporting numerous defensive actions. The last operational T-28s were withdrawn from frontline service in early 1943. By this point, Soviet production of T-34s and KV-1s had reached levels where older designs were simply unnecessary. The surviving T-28s were relegated to training duties, providing instruction in gunnery and tactics to new tank crews before they transitioned to more modern vehicles. Captured German documents from 1943, analysing the Eastern Front's first 2 years, devoted considerable space to Soviet armour. The T-28 received extensive discussion. Despite its relatively brief combat career, the assessment acknowledged that the tank's effectiveness had surprised German forces and contributed to the difficult first months of Operation Barbarossa. One particularly revealing document, a training memorandum distributed to panzer units in February 1943, used the T-28 as an example of intelligence failure. Officers are reminded that technical specifications alone do not determine combat effectiveness. The Soviet T-28, dismissed as obsolete by pre-war intelligence, proved highly effective in combat. Its large-caliber gun, adequate armour and multi-turret configuration created a capable weapon system. Assumptions about enemy inferiority proved costly. When encountering new or unfamiliar enemy equipment, commanders must rely on direct observation and combat results rather than preconceived assessments. Overconfidence in our technical superiority and dismissiveness toward enemy capabilities contributed to unnecessary casualties in the campaign's early phases. Post-war interviews with German veterans consistently mentioned the T-28 as one of several Soviet weapons that had surprised them in Barbarossa's opening weeks. General-Leutnant Hans von Luck, who commanded various armoured formations on the Eastern Front, later wrote in his memoirs about the T-28. "We expected to face an enemy equipped with obsolete weapons and characterised by tactical incompetence. The T-28 was our first indication that Soviet capabilities had been grossly underestimated. These tanks, which our intelligence had dismissed as museum pieces, destroyed our Panzer IIIs with disturbing ease. The Soviet 70 mm gun was a revelation. We had nothing comparable. Our own 50 mm guns, which had performed well in France, bounced shells off Soviet armour. The combat debut of the T-28 against our forces was a harsh lesson in the dangers of underestimating one's opponent. It cost us men and machines we could ill afford to lose. Soviet historians, constrained by political requirements to emphasize Soviet superiority, often downplayed the T-28's importance. The tank's pre-war design and mechanical problems didn't fit narratives of Soviet technological excellence. Post-war accounts emphasized the T-34 and KV-1 while treating the T-28 as a footnote. This created a historical irony. German sources extensively documented T-28 effectiveness because it shocked them. Soviet sources minimized T-28 achievements because acknowledging that a supposedly obsolete design could outfight German armor complicated preferred narratives about Soviet military superiority. The result was a weapon system whose significance was obscured from both sides' historical accounts. Modern analysis, drawing on archives made available after the Soviet Union's collapse, has revised understanding of the T-28's role. Combat records previously classified revealed the tank's effectiveness in skilled hands and its impact on German tactical development. The T-28 represented an intermediate stage in Soviet tank design, more capable than light tanks but less sophisticated than the T-34. Yet in June 1941, it was among the most powerful tanks in combat anywhere in the world. Its 70 mm gun outclassed the armament of German, British and American tanks then in service. Its armour, particularly on up-armoured variants, provided adequate protection against most contemporary anti-tank weapons. The statistical record supports this assessment. In engagements where T-28s were properly supported and maintained, they achieved favourable exchange ratios against German armour. A Soviet General Staff study compiled in 1943 but not published until after the Soviet Union's collapse, analysed tank combat in Operation Barbarossa's first month. The report noted that T-28s, when operational, destroyed an average of 1.7 German tanks before being knocked out in combat. This compared favourably to the T-26 light tank at 0.3 German tanks destroyed per loss, and even exceeded the early performance of T-34s at 1.4. Likely because T-34 crews in June 1941 were less trained and familiar with their vehicles than T-28 crews who had been operating their tanks for months or years. The mechanical reliability problems that plagued the T-28 throughout its service life reflected broader Soviet industrial challenges. Soviet factories in the 1930s, staffed by workers often only one generation removed from peasant agriculture, struggled to maintain the precise tolerances required for complex machinery. Quality control was inconsistent. Parts from different production batches often didn't fit properly. Metallurgy, while improving, remained inferior to Western standards. These problems affected all Soviet vehicles but were particularly evident in the T-28 due to its complex transmission and powerful engine. Yet Soviet designers had anticipated reliability problems and incorporated solutions. The T-28's suspension used interchangeable road wheels that could be quickly replaced. The engine, while problematic, could be removed and replaced in the field, given adequate tools and a recovery vehicle. The transmission, despite its complexity, could be partially disassembled for repairs without removing the entire unit. These features reflected a design philosophy that accepted mechanical problems as inevitable, but sought to minimize their operational impact. The comparison between the T-28 and German medium tanks of 1941 reveals interesting design philosophies. German tanks emphasized refined engineering, precision manufacturing, and tactical sophistication. They were complex machines requiring skilled crews and extensive maintenance, but offering excellent performance when properly maintained and employed. Soviet tanks emphasized simplicity, mass production, and overwhelming firepower. They accepted lower reliability and less sophisticated engineering in exchange for numerical superiority and devastating weapons. The T-28 represented an intermediate approach, more complex than later Soviet designs but simpler than German equivalents. This design philosophy proved vindicated by combat experience. While individual German tanks might outperform individual Soviet tanks in carefully controlled engagements, the reality of combat on the Eastern Front favoured weapons that could be produced in quantity, maintained under field conditions, and employed by hastily trained crews. The T-28, despite its problems, met these requirements better than German planners had anticipated. The tank's multi-turret configuration, often cited as evidence of design obsolescence, actually reflected sophisticated tactical thinking. Soviet theorists in the early 1930s anticipated breakthrough operations against fortified positions with extensive infantry support. In this context, multiple machine guns providing all-around defensive fire made perfect sense. The configuration's limitations only became apparent when tank warfare evolved toward more mobile operations emphasizing tank versus tank combat. Even then, the forward machine gun turrets proved useful in close-quarters fighting. German infantry quickly learned that approaching a T-28 was hazardous from any direction. The tank's machine gunners could engage infantry in dead zones where the main gun couldn't depress sufficiently. This capability, combined with the 76mm gun's high explosive rounds, made the T-28 a formidable infantry support weapon even when its anti-tank capabilities were overshadowed by newer designs. The T-28's combat debut in Operation Barbarossa represented a pivotal moment in the Eastern Front's development. It demonstrated that Soviet armour capabilities had been catastrophically underestimated by German intelligence. It forced German tactical adaptations that diverted resources and complicated operations. Most significantly, it provided an early warning that German material superiority, taken for granted by Wehrmacht planners, was illusory. The shock experienced by German troops encountering T-28s in June 1941 would be magnified exponentially when T-34s and KV-1s appeared in larger numbers. But the T-28 delivered the first blow to German confidence, the first indication that the campaign would not proceed according to plan. In the broader context of World War II armour development, the T-28 represented an evolutionary dead end. Multi-turret tanks, pursued by many nations in the 1930s, proved inferior to more conventional single-turret designs. The additional weight, complexity, and crew requirements of multiple turrets outweighed their tactical benefits. Every major nation abandoned multi-turret designs by the early 1940s, yet the T-28's specific design features influenced Soviet tank development. The 76mm gun became standard armament for Soviet medium tanks throughout the war. The emphasis on infantry support capabilities persisted in Soviet design thinking. The acceptance of mechanical reliability problems in exchange for firepower and armour became a defining characteristic of Soviet armour philosophy. The T-28 also influenced Soviet training and doctrine. Crews trained on T-28s, learning gunnery and tactics, subsequently transferred to T-34s, bringing valuable experience. The lessons of multi-turret coordination, while not directly applicable to single-turret tanks, taught crew members the importance of all-around observation and defensive fire. Tank commanders learned to coordinate multiple weapon systems and manage complex mechanical systems. At the United States Army Ordnance Museum at Aberdeen Proving Ground, before its closure and relocation, a captured T-28 sat among other foreign vehicles. The placard noted its specifications and service history, but couldn't convey the shock it delivered to German forces in 1941. The tank, obsolete by any objective measure when Operation Barbarossa began, had outfought Germany's frontline panzers and forced a re-evaluation of Soviet capabilities. A single anecdote captured in German combat records illustrates the T-28's impact. In July 1941, after several weeks of brutal fighting, a panzer company commander was briefing newly arrived replacement crews on Soviet armour. He displayed photographs of various Soviet tanks, describing their capabilities and vulnerabilities. When he reached the T-28, several veterans in the audience visibly tensed. One replacement crew member, fresh from training in Germany, laughed at the photograph. "Look at that monstrosity with 3 turrets. It looks like someone welded 3 different tanks together. Who designed that thing?" The company commander's response was sharp. "That thing, as you call it, killed half my company in the first week of fighting. Its gun will penetrate your panzer at any range while your 50mm bounces off its armour. Those 3 turrets mean it can shoot at you from any angle while you're trying to manoeuvre for a flank shot." Men who laughed at these tanks are dead now. I suggest you treat every Soviet tank, no matter how odd it looks, as a lethal threat. Because they are. The replacement crews stopped laughing. The T-28 entered combat in June 1941 as an allegedly obsolete relic and emerged as a weapon that shocked German forces, altered tactics, and contributed to the Wehrmacht's growing recognition that the Soviet Union possessed military capabilities far exceeding intelligence estimates. In between, it demonstrated that obsolescence is a relative concept determined not by age but by combat effectiveness. German soldiers who survived encounters with T-28s carried memories of a tank that shouldn't have been dangerous but was, a weapon that intelligence had dismissed but that killed with devastating efficiency, a symbol of how badly German planners had misunderstood their opponent. By the time T-34s and KV-1s dominated the narrative of tank warfare on the Eastern Front, the T-28 had already delivered its message. Soviet armour would not be swept aside like chaff. The thunder that would eventually belong to the T-34 had been preceded by the roar of 70-centimeter guns mounted in ungainly multi-turret, machines that German intelligence had foolishly ignored. The final operational use of T-28s in combat roles occurred in early 1943 during the Leningrad Front's operations. Several tanks that had been immobilized and converted into static fortifications were still manned by their original crews, men who had operated these machines since before the war began. These crews had developed an almost intimate knowledge of their vehicles' capabilities and limitations. Senior Sergeant Viktor Mikhailovich Borisov had commanded the same T-28 since May 1941. His tank, positioned in a fortified emplacement near the Pulkovo Heights, overlooking Leningrad, had survived nearly 2 years of combat. The original M17 engine had been replaced twice, the transmission had been rebuilt 4 times, the tracks were on their 3rd set, but the 70-centimeter gun still functioned perfectly, and the armour, though pockmarked with impact scars, still protected the crew. Borisov later recounted his experience in an interview conducted in 1975 for a Soviet military history project. The Germans had learned to respect our T-28s. In the early days, they would advance confidently, expecting to destroy us easily. By 1943, they approached our positions with extreme caution. They knew that our gun could kill their tanks at ranges where they struggled to penetrate our armour, especially in our fortified positions where only the turret was exposed. I remember one engagement in January 1943. A German assault force, including 7 Panzer IVs with the new long-barreled guns, advanced toward our positions. These new guns were dangerous. They could penetrate our armour at combat ranges, but we had advantages they didn't. We knew the exact range to every piece of terrain in front of our position. We had pre-registered firing data. We had overhead cover protecting us from artillery. The Germans advanced cautiously, using terrain for cover. At 100 metres, the lead tank exposed itself crossing an open area. My gunner, Corporal Yegorov, had been with me since 1941. He knew that gun better than his own hands. 1 shot. The German tank stopped, smoke pouring from the engine compartment. The others immediately took cover. They called in artillery. For 30 minutes, shells rained down on our position. Our overhead protection held. When the barrage lifted, they tried again. This time, 2 tanks advanced together, attempting to suppress us with fire, while others manoeuvred. Yegorov engaged the left tank. Hit. The right tank fired at us. The shell struck our turret front but didn't penetrate. The angle of our position deflected it upward. We engaged the second tank. Another hit. Now the Germans were hesitant. They had lost 2 tanks and hadn't even reached our main defensive line. They withdrew after destroying what they thought was our position with another artillery barrage. We were buttoned up inside, waiting. When they tried a 3rd time, we destroyed another tank before they finally gave up. That old T-28, which German intelligence had called obsolete in 1941, held that position until April 1943 when we were finally rotated out. The tank had destroyed 19 German armoured vehicles confirmed, plus countless soft targets. When we were withdrawn, they offered me a new T-34. I almost didn't want to leave that old machine. It had kept us alive for 2 years. The German assessment of Soviet armour evolved dramatically between June 1941 and the war's end. Intelligence reports from 1944 analysing the progression of Soviet tank capabilities devoted significant attention to the lessons learned from early encounters. One report, prepared for the General Staff in March 1944, specifically addressed the intelligence failures of 1941. The underestimation of Soviet armor capabilities in June 1941 stemmed from multiple analytical failures. First, we evaluated Soviet tanks based on design age rather than combat effectiveness. The T-28, designed in 1933, was dismissed as obsolete without proper analysis of its actual capabilities. In reality, its 76mm gun was superior to weapons mounted on our Panzer III and short-barreled Panzer IV. Its armour, particularly up-armoured variants, was adequate against our standard anti-tank weapons. Second, we failed to recognise that Soviet design philosophy prioritised different characteristics than German designs. We valued refined engineering and tactical sophistication. The Soviets valued firepower, armour protection, and mass production. In prolonged combat, the Soviet approach proved more effective. Third, we assumed that the Soviet Union's industrial capabilities were primitive and could not support modern tank production. This assumption was contradicted by the simple fact that the Soviets were producing complex machines like the T-28 in substantial numbers, while simultaneously developing more advanced designs. The T-28's combat performance in June and July 1941 should have served as an immediate warning that our entire intelligence picture was flawed. Instead, we rationalized the tank's effectiveness as an anomaly. When T-34s and KV-1s appeared, we were forced to confront the reality that Soviet armor capabilities exceeded our own across multiple categories. The institutional failure to properly assess Soviet capabilities before Operation Barbarossa contributed significantly to the campaign's unexpected difficulties. Better intelligence might not have changed the strategic outcome, but it would have resulted in better tactical preparation and reduced casualties. This remarkably candid assessment, written for internal military consumption rather than propaganda purposes, acknowledged what German combat troops had learned at terrible cost. The Soviet Union's military capabilities, including supposedly obsolete equipment like the T-28, had been systematically underestimated by every level of German intelligence. The T-28's influence extended beyond its direct combat role. The shock it delivered to German forces contributed to a broader reassessment of Soviet capabilities that influenced German strategy. The realization that Soviet armor included not just modern T-34s and KV-1s, but also older designs that could outfight German tanks, suggested that the Soviet Union possessed greater industrial depth than anticipated. This recognition contributed to increasingly desperate German attempts to achieve quick victory before Soviet industrial capacity could be fully mobilized. The failed drive on Moscow in late 1941, the disastrous 1942 offensive towards Stalingrad and the Caucasus, and the catastrophic attack at Kursk in 1943 all reflected German awareness that time favored the Soviets. Each failed offensive was partly motivated by understanding that Soviet production of tanks, aircraft and other weapons was accelerating while German production struggled to replace losses. The T-28 also influenced Allied intelligence assessments. British and American observers, monitoring the Eastern Front and receiving reports from various sources, noted German difficulties with Soviet armour. When Lend-Lease discussions addressed Soviet equipment needs, Western understanding of Soviet tank capabilities was informed partly by German experiences with tanks like the T-28. British intelligence reports from late 1941 analysing Soviet armour capabilities devoted considerable attention to the T-28. One assessment, prepared by the War Office in November 1941, drew on German reports, Soviet statements, and analysis by British technical experts. The Soviet T-28 medium tank represents a design philosophy significantly different from British or German approaches. The multi-turret configuration, while unusual, provides excellent all-around defensive capability. The 76.2mm gun is comparable to our 3-inch weapon, and superior to anything mounted on German medium tanks currently deployed. The tank's mechanical reliability appears problematic, though this may reflect Soviet maintenance practices as much as design flaws. Combat effectiveness, when the vehicle is operational and properly crewed, appears substantial. German reports indicate considerable respect for this weapon despite its age. This assessment suggests that Soviet tank design in the 1930s was more sophisticated than previously recognized. If the T-28, designed in 1933, remains combat effective in 1941, Soviet industrial and engineering capabilities have been underestimated. The appearance of more modern Soviet tanks with even better capabilities should be anticipated. This measured British assessment contrasted sharply with German intelligence failures. British analysts, perhaps because they lacked German overconfidence and had experienced their own intelligence failures in the early war years, approached Soviet capabilities more cautiously. The recognition that the T-28 remained effective despite its age informed British understanding that Soviet military capabilities deserved serious respect. American intelligence, similarly analysing Soviet armour for the first time in 1941, drew comparable conclusions. A US Army Ordnance Department report from December 1941 assessed Soviet tanks based on available information. The report's section on the T-28 noted that the design represented an evolutionary stage in tank development that retained combat relevance despite being superseded by more modern vehicles. The most significant conclusion was that Soviet willingness to commit substantial resources to tank development in the early 1930s indicated a long-term commitment to armoured warfare that Western nations had not fully appreciated. The T-28's existence demonstrated that the Soviet Union had been seriously developing armoured forces for a decade before Operation Barbarossa, suggesting a depth of experience and institutional knowledge that contradicted assumptions about Soviet technological backwardness. These Western intelligence assessments, while academic for forces not yet engaged on the Eastern Front, would inform later decisions about equipment provision through lend-lease and shape understanding of Soviet military effectiveness. The recognition that the Soviet Union possessed capable armoured forces, including older designs that remained combat effective, influenced Allied strategic planning and contributed to confidence that the Soviet Union could continue resisting German attacks. For the individual soldiers who encountered T-28s in combat, the experience left lasting impressions that transcended statistical analysis or intelligence assessments. The psychological impact of discovering that your weapons were inadequate against an enemy you had been told was inferior created trauma that persisted long after the specific engagements ended. Unteroffizier Wilhelm Schneider, a Panther III gunner in the 11th Panzer Division, was interviewed in 1983 for a documentary about the Eastern Front. His memories of encountering T-28s in June 1941 remained vivid 4 decades later. We had been told repeatedly that Soviet tanks were obsolete, that Soviet crews were incompetent, that we would sweep them aside easily. The first week of combat shattered every one of those assumptions. I remember my first encounter with a T-28. We were advancing down a road in Lithuania when our lead tank exploded. Just exploded. The turret flew off, cartwheeling through the air. We deployed for combat, searching for the enemy. Then this massive tank emerged from behind a farm building. 3 turrets. Enormous. It looked like something from a science fiction story. Our commander ordered us to engage. I fired at 700 meters, hit the turret front, no effect. I fired again. Another hit. The shell just bounced off. The Soviet tank traversed its gun toward us, very deliberately. I could see the barrel. This huge gun, much larger than anything I expected. It fired once. The tank next to us, Lieutenant Weber's Panzer, was destroyed instantly. The shell went completely through the frontal armour. We tried to manoeuvre for a flank shot, but this tank was surprisingly agile. It turned to follow us, keeping its frontal armour toward us. Meanwhile, the smaller turrets were firing machine guns, forcing our infantry to take cover. We couldn't get close because of those machine guns. We couldn't penetrate frontally. We were helpless. Finally, our platoon leader called in a Stuka strike. The dive bombers hit that tank with multiple bombs before it stopped moving. Even then, we approached cautiously. When we examined it, we counted more than 20 hits from our 50mm guns. Not one had penetrated the frontal armour. Every shot had either bounced off or made superficial damage. That was my introduction to combat on the Eastern Front. Everything we had been told was wrong. The enemy wasn't inferior. Their equipment wasn't obsolete. We weren't going to win easily. That first week taught me that this war would be nothing like Poland or France. It would be a nightmare that would last for years. I was right. Such testimonies, collected decades after the events, revealed the profound psychological impact of the T-28's combat debut. German soldiers had been psychologically prepared for easy victory through overwhelming superiority. Discovering that Soviet weapons could destroy German equipment while resisting German attacks undermined confidence and created fear that persisted throughout the Eastern Front campaign. The few surviving T-28s became museum pieces after the war, tangible reminders of Soviet industrial development in the 1930s. The tank at the Kubinka Tank Museum outside Moscow, preserved in running condition with its original M17 engine and mechanical systems, represented the most complete surviving example. Museum guides, when conducting tours for foreign visitors during the Cold War, would emphasize the T-28's modernity for its time and its effectiveness in combat. During one such tour in 1978, attended by a delegation of Western military historians, the Soviet guide provided extensive details about the T-28's combat record. When one historian questioned whether an early 1930s design could have been truly effective against German panzers in 1941, the guide responded with a statement that revealed Soviet pride in the tank's achievements. This tank shocked the Wehrmacht. German intelligence had dismissed it as obsolete. German tankers discovered that it could destroy their panzers while their guns bounced off our armour. The 76 mm gun you see here was more powerful than anything mounted on German medium tanks in 1941. The armour, especially after we added the bolt-on screens you see on this example, could resist German anti-tank guns at combat ranges. Yes, the T-34 and KV-1 were superior designs. Yes, the T-28 had mechanical problems, but when Germany invaded, we had hundreds of these tanks in service, crewed by trained men who knew how to use them. The T-28 bought us time while we mobilized our industry and deployed newer designs in quantity. It demonstrated to the Germans that they had underestimated Soviet capabilities. That lesson cost them dearly. This post-war narrative, while containing elements of propaganda, reflected genuine Soviet pride in a weapon that had performed better than its age suggested. The T-28 represented Soviet industrial achievement in the 1930s, a period when the Soviet Union transformed from an agricultural nation into an industrial power. The tank's combat effectiveness validated the resources invested in its development and production. Modern historical research, benefiting from access to archives and documents unavailable during the Cold War, has provided more nuanced understanding of the T-28's role. The tank was neither as obsolete as German pre-war intelligence claimed nor as uniformly successful as Soviet post-war accounts suggested. It was a complex weapon system, with significant strengths and equally significant weaknesses, capable of devastating effectiveness when properly employed but vulnerable to mechanical failure and tactical misuse. The most balanced assessment came from a comparative study of World War II tank effectiveness published in 2005. The study analysed combat records, technical specifications, and post-war evaluations to assess various tanks' actual combat performance versus their theoretical capabilities. The T-28 received extensive analysis as an example of a weapon whose combat effectiveness exceeded expectations based on its age and specifications. The study concluded that the T-28's success in early Operation Barbarossa stemmed from three factors. First, its 76mm gun provided genuine superiority over German tank armament in anti-tank roles. Second, its armour protection, while not exceptional by later war standards, was adequate against German anti-tank weapons in 1941. Third, and perhaps most significantly, German tactical doctrine and crew training had not prepared them for facing tanks that could outgun their own vehicles. The study also noted that the T-28's weaknesses, particularly mechanical reliability, limited its long-term effectiveness, but did not negate its impact in the critical first months of the German invasion. The tank's role was not to win the war, but to buy time, inflict casualties, and force German tactical adaptations. In these objectives, it succeeded. The human stories behind the T-28's combat service revealed the reality of armoured warfare beyond statistics and technical specifications. Lieutenant Anna Petrovna Volkova, one of the rare female tank crew members in the early war period, served as a loader in a T-28 during the defence of Leningrad. Her memoirs, published in 1995 after decades of Soviet censorship preventing frank discussion of early war difficulties, provided intimate details of life inside a T-28 during combat. The T-28 was spacious compared to lighter tanks, but during combat it felt cramped and claustrophobic. The noise was incredible. The engine roar, the gun blast, the impact of shells striking our armour. You couldn't hear verbal commands. Everything was by touch and gesture. My job was loading the 76mm gun. Each shell weighed 6.5 kilograms. During intense combat, I would load 20 or 30 shells in a few minutes. My arms and shoulders ached constantly. The worst was when we were hit but not penetrated. The shell would strike the armour with a tremendous bang. The entire crew would be stunned. Sometimes crew members would be knocked unconscious by the shock even when the armour wasn't penetrated. The commander, Lieutenant Orloff, was wounded twice by fragments that came through vision slits. He refused evacuation both times. I remember one engagement in July 1941. We were supporting infantry attacking German positions near me as German anti-tank guns engaged us from concealed positions. I heard impacts, 3 or 4 in quick succession. The tank kept moving. Our gunner, Sergeant Koslov, fired at the anti-tank gun positions. I loaded as fast as I could. High explosive. Armour-piercing, high explosive. The breech would recoil violently with each shot. You had to time the loading carefully or risk injury. We destroyed 2 anti-tank guns and several machine gun positions before our track was hit by an 80 T-28 shell. The track separated. We couldn't move. We became a stationary pillbox, continuing to fire while German infantry tried to approach. Our machine gunners in the forward turrets kept them at bay. We fired every shell we had 69 rounds before the infantry relieved us. When we finally evacuated the tank, I counted 14 impact marks on the armour. Not one had penetrated. That old tank saved our lives repeatedly. I was reassigned to a T-34 later in the war. The T-34 was faster, more reliable, better designed. But I always remembered that T-28. It wasn't elegant or modern, but it did its job when we needed it most. Such personal accounts reveal dimensions of the T-28's service that official records couldn't capture. The tank represented safety to crews who trusted its armour protection. It provided firepower that gave them confidence when facing German forces. Its spacious interior, a seeming disadvantage in terms of vehicle size, actually improved crew efficiency and reduced fatigue during extended combat. The final chapter of the T-28 story involved the handful of tanks that survived the war intact. Several were preserved as monuments, placed on pedestals in cities that had been defended by T-28 units. Others went to museums, where they served as educational tools teaching new generations about Soviet military history. A few were retained by the Soviet Army for training purposes, teaching mechanics and crews about older technology. One T-28, which had been buried in a swamp near Leningrad after being damaged in 1941, was recovered in 1997 by Russian military historians. The excavation, documented on film, revealed a remarkably complete tank, its mechanical systems preserved by the anaerobic conditions of the swamp. Restoration took 3 years, but in 2000 the tank was returned to running condition. During the restoration, technicians discovered details that illustrated the T-28's combat service. The armour showed multiple impact marks from German weapons. The engine had been replaced at some point, likely a field repair. Inside the turret, scratched into the metal, were the names of crew members and dates ranging from 1939 to 1941. These names were later matched to military records, revealing that the tank had served in Finland during the Winter War before being deployed against German forces in June 1941. The discovery of such artifacts provided tangible connections to the men who had operated these machines under combat conditions. The scratched names represented individuals who had lived, fought, and in some cases died while serving in these tanks. Their presence transformed the T-28 from a collection of mechanical components into a memorial to human experience. The T-28's legacy in tank development was complex. The multi-turret configuration was abandoned as a dead end, but many specific features influenced subsequent designs. The 76mm gun evolved into the variants mounted on T-34s and KV-1s. The emphasis on infantry support capability persisted in Soviet design thinking. The acceptance of mechanical complexity in exchange for combat capability became a defining characteristic of Soviet armour throughout the war. More significantly, the T-28's combat performance influenced how both Soviet and German forces approached tank development. Soviet designers, validated in their emphasis on powerful guns and adequate armour, continued pursuing these characteristics in subsequent designs. German designers, shocked by Soviet gun power, urgently developed more capable weapons, leading to the long-barreled 75 mm and 80 mm guns that would arm later panzers. The intellectual legacy involved recognition that obsolescence was contextual rather than absolute. A weapon's effectiveness depended not just on its specifications, but on how it compared to opponents' capabilities, how it was employed tactically, and what industrial and logistical support sustained it. The T-28, obsolete by some measures, remained combat effective because it mounted a gun superior to German tank armament and was deployed against an opponent whose intelligence had failed to recognize its capabilities. This lesson resonated beyond the specific case of the T-28. Military planners in multiple nations reassessed their assumptions about equipment life cycles and technological superiority. The recognition that older equipment could remain effective under the right circumstances influenced decisions about weapon system retention, upgrade programs, and resource allocation between developing new systems versus improving existing ones. In the final analysis, the T-28's significance lay not in its technical specifications or production numbers, but in its role as an agent of revelation. It revealed to German forces that Soviet capabilities had been catastrophically underestimated. It revealed to Soviet forces that their pre-war designs, despite problems, could compete with German equipment. It revealed to both sides that the Eastern Front would be a conflict where assumptions would be shattered and victory would demand adaptation. The ungainly multi-turret tank that German intelligence had dismissed rolled out of the trees along the Soviet frontier in June 1941 and announced through the thunder of its 76-meter gun that the war in the East would not follow the script German planners had written. It fought for 2 years in conditions that destroyed most weapons, crewed by men and women who trusted it to keep them alive while they inflicted losses on an enemy that had underestimated them. When the last operational T-28 was withdrawn from combat in 1943, it left behind a combat record that defied its reputation. Hundreds of German tanks destroyed, thousands of soft targets eliminated, countless defensive positions held against overwhelming odds. Most importantly, it had bought time for Soviet industry to mobilize, for newer designs to reach the front in quantity, and for the Red Army to transform from a reeling victim into a force capable of driving to Berlin. The T-28 shocked German troops before the T-34 arrived not through technological sophistication, but through the brutal simplicity of effective combat power. It mounted a bigger gun than German tanks, its armour resisted German weapons, its crews knew how to use it. In June 1941, when German forces crossed into Soviet territory expecting easy victory, these 3 factors were sufficient to deliver a shock that reverberated through the Wehrmacht and contributed to the eventual German defeat on the Eastern Front. The flying milk bottle that became the Thunderbolt had its counterpart on the ground, a rolling pillbox that became a nightmare. Both proved that underestimating one's opponent, dismissing their weapons as obsolete, and assuming technological superiority based on flawed intelligence were mistakes that would be paid for in blood. The T-28 delivered that lesson at the very beginning of the Eastern Front campaign. The Wehrmacht spent the next 4 years learning it over and over until there was nothing left to learn and nowhere left to retreat.